The Arizona sun cast long shadows across the parched earth as Abigail Carter stepped onto the porch of her family's ranch house. At 32, her face had begun to show the fine lines etched by years of hard work and solitude, but her eyes remained as clear and determined as they had been in her youth. She brushed back a strand of chestnut hair that had escaped her practical bun and gazed out at the vast landscape that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. 20 years had passed since that night, the night that had changed everything. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, Abigail could still hear the soft, labored breathing of the Apache boy her father had brought home, half dead and bleeding from a gunshot wound. She had been 12 then, curious and frightened, watching from the shadows as her parents worked to save the life of a child their neighbors would have left to die. "Abby," her mother had whispered, beckoning her forward, "bring me more clean rags." It was the first time she had seen someone from the tribe up close. The boy couldn't have been more than 14, his dark eyes burning with fever and fear. What struck her most wasn't his difference but his youth, how vulnerable he looked despite the stoic set of his jaw. For 3 weeks, they had hidden him in their root cellar, nursing him back to health while her father told everyone in town that they were battling a family illness. It was dangerous work. Relations between settlers and the Apache were strained to the breaking point, with violence erupting like summer thunderstorms across the territory. "Why are we helping him, Pa?" she had asked one night as they changed the boy's bandages. Her father, a man of few words but deep conviction, had looked at her steadily. "Because before we're white or Apache, American or anything else, we're human beings, Abby, and that matters more than any boundary line drawn on a map." The boy had said little during his recovery, but his eyes followed Abigail whenever she brought him food or fresh water. She had taught him a few English words, and he had shown her how to weave a small basket from the reeds near the creek. They communicated in gestures and half-understood phrases, building a fragile bridge between worlds that rarely touched without violence. On the night before he left, when he was strong enough to return to his people, he had taken her hand in the darkness of the cellar. "I am Taza," he had said in carefully practiced English. "I will not forget. One day I return." She had nodded solemnly, not fully comprehending the weight of the moment. "I'm Abigail." "Abby." He had pressed something into her palm, a small carved stone eagle polished smooth. To remember. A promise. By morning he was gone, melting into the desert landscape like mist after sunrise. Now, 20 years later, Abigail clutched that same eagle stone in her pocket, as she did every morning when she surveyed her land. Her parents were long gone, her father taken by pneumonia 8 years past, her mother following just months later as if unwilling to remain in a world without him. The ranch had fallen to Abigail, an unmarried woman in a territory where solitary female landowners were viewed with suspicion at best and predatory interest at worst. She had persevered through drought and hardship, through the unwanted attentions of neighboring rancher Wallace Thornton, through the whispers in town that she was peculiar for choosing solitude over marriage. The ranch wasn't prosperous, but it was hers, and she had learned to defend what was hers with the same quiet determination that had defined her father. "Miss Carter!" The call came from the direction of the barn, where Thomas, the aging cowhand who had worked for her father and stayed on after his death, was pointing toward the horizon. Abigail squinted against the harsh light, making out a lone rider approaching along the dusty road that connected the ranch to the main trail. Visitors were rare and seldom welcome. Instinctively, Abigail reached for the rifle she kept by the door. "Shall I send him on his way?" Thomas called, already moving toward his own weapon. "No," Abigail replied, something in the stranger's silhouette catching her attention. "I'll see to it." She stepped off the porch, rifle held casually but ready, and walked toward the property line. The rider approached slowly, deliberately, giving her plenty of time to observe him. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders outlined against the sky. He wore a combination of white man's clothing and traditional Apache garments, cotton trousers and a loose shirt beneath a vest adorned with beadwork, his long black hair tied back with a leather cord. As he drew closer, Abigail's heart began to pound against her ribs. There was something familiar in the set of his jaw, in the intensity of his gaze. He stopped his horse 20 paces from where she stood and dismounted with fluid grace. Standing before her was a man in his mid-30s, his face weathered by sun and hardship, his dark eyes holding hers with an unflinching directness that few men dared. "Abby," he said, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. The rifle trembled in her hands. "No one calls me that anymore." "I called you that," he replied, taking a step forward. "When you taught me English words. When you brought me water when no one was looking." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "Taza," he nodded once, a slight smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I made a promise." The years between them seemed to collapse like a house of cards in a strong wind. Abigail saw in his face the shadow of the boy she had known, transformed now into a man of remarkable presence. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the stone eagle. "I kept it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time." Taza's eyes softened as he looked at the carving in her palm, "and I kept my word." Behind them, Thomas approached warily, his hand hovering near his holster. "Miss Carter, everything all right?" Abigail turned, composing herself with visible effort. "Yes, Thomas, this is an old friend. Please see to his horse." Thomas hesitated, eyeing the Apache man with unconcealed suspicion. "It's all right," Abigail assured him. "Please." As Thomas reluctantly led Taza's horse toward the barn, Abigail turned back to the man who had materialized from her past like a mirage. "Why now?" she asked. "After all these years?" Taza's expression grew solemn. "I have walked many paths since I left this place. I have fought in wars not of my choosing. I have seen my people pushed further from their homes. But I never forgot the family who saved me when others would have let me die." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the ranch. "I heard about your parents, that you were alone now." A familiar pang of grief tightened Abigail's chest. "News travels, even to Apache lands?" "I have friends in many places," Taza replied. "When I learned you were here alone, I knew it was time to fulfill my promise." "And what promise was that?" Abigail asked, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the strange tension in the air between them. Taza's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "To protect what once protected me." The kitchen was filled with the scent of fresh bread and coffee as Abigail placed a steaming mug before Taza. He sat at her father's old chair, his presence somehow making the room seem smaller than it had ever been. Thomas had retired to his cabin near the barn after Abigail assured him, multiple times, that she was safe with their visitor. "You've kept the house the same," Taza observed, his eyes moving over the familiar wooden beams, the stone fireplace, the worn table where he had once sat as a boy, learning to hold a fork and knife in the Apache way. "Some things change," Abigail replied, taking the seat across from him. "Others remain." She studied him openly now, noting the scars on his hands, the watchful alertness that never seemed to leave him, even in repose. "You speak English well now." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I had a good teacher. 3 weeks of lessons from a 12-year-old girl hardly makes for fluency," she countered. "After I left here, I spent time at the mission school. Later, I worked as a scout for the army." Something flickered across his face, pain perhaps, or regret. "I learned many things from the white man's world." Abigail's brow furrowed. "You scouted for the army, against your own people." Taza's jaw tightened. "The choices given to my people were few. Fight and die, surrender and starve on the reservation, or find a way to walk between worlds." He met her gaze steadily. "I chose the path that would keep me alive. That would let me keep my promise." The weight of history hung between them. The brutal campaigns against the Apache, the resistance led by chiefs like Cochise and Geronimo, the relentless march of white settlement across lands that had once belonged to his people. "And now?" Abigail asked. "What path do you walk now?" "My own," Taza replied simply. "I left the army 3 years ago. I've been living near the border, trading, hunting, moving between the white world and what remains of mine." Abigail nodded, understanding what he didn't say, that he belonged fully to neither world anymore, that he had become something between, something new. "And you," Taza continued, his gaze softening as it moved over her face. "You never married?" A flush crept up Abigail's neck. "No. There was the ranch to run after my parents died. And she hesitated. "I never met anyone I wanted to change my life for." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The day was waning, the fierce Arizona sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains. "You should stay the night," Abigail said suddenly, surprising herself with the offer. It's too late to start back anywhere else. Taza studied her face for a long moment before nodding. Thank you. As Abigail prepared the small guest room, she tried to make sense of the tumult of emotions stirring within her. The boy she had known had returned as a man who carried himself with quiet dignity and strength, a man whose presence stirred something in her that she had never allowed herself to acknowledge before. That night she lay awake in her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about her home. Through the thin walls, she could hear Taza's footsteps as he paced the guest room, restless as she was. The knowledge that he was there, just on the other side of the wall, filled her with a strange mixture of comfort and disquiet. Morning came with the crowing of roosters and the first pale fingers of dawn stretching across the eastern sky. Abigail rose early, as was her habit, to find Taza already outside, splitting wood for the stove with precise, powerful strokes. She paused in the doorway, watching the fluid movement of his shoulders beneath his shirt, the controlled strength in each swing of the axe. When he sensed her presence and turned, their eyes met across the yard, and something electric passed between them, an unspoken recognition that transcended the years and differences that separated them. "You don't have to do that," she said, approaching him. "I want to help," Taza replied, setting down the axe. "While I'm here." The implication that his stay was temporary hung in the air between them. "How long will that be?" Abigail asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Before Taza could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the road. 3 riders appeared, moving at a purposeful trot toward the ranch house. Abigail recognized the man in the lead immediately. Wallace Thornton, owner of the neighboring spread, and a man who had made his interest in both her and her land abundantly clear over the years. "Trouble?" Taza asked quietly, moving to stand beside her. "Possibly," Abigail murmured. "Wallace Thornton. He's been trying to buy my land for years." Thornton reined in his horse, his eyes narrowing as they fell on Taza. The 2 men flanking him, ranch hands with hard eyes and gun-calloused hands, spread out slightly, a subtle but unmistakable display of force. "Morning, Miss Carter," Thornton called, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. He was a large man in his 40s, prosperous and accustomed to getting his way. "Didn't realize you had company." "Mr. Thornton," Abigail acknowledged coolly. "What brings you by so early?" Thornton's gaze never left Taza. "Just being neighborly. Heard you might be having some difficulties with your cattle. Thought I'd offer my assistance." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Seems you've found help elsewhere." "This is an old friend," Abigail said, deliberately not offering Taza's name. "And my cattle are fine, thank you." "Friend, is it?" Thornton's tone made the word sound like an accusation. "Didn't know you were acquainted with the local Indians, Miss Carter." Taza stood perfectly still beside her, his face impassive, but Abigail could sense the tension in him, coiled and ready. "I'm acquainted with whom I choose, Mr. Thornton," she replied sharply. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." Thornton's jaw tightened. "Be careful, Miss Carter. Folk around here have long memories about what happened during the Apache raids. Wouldn't want people getting the wrong idea about your associations." The threat in his words was unmistakable. "Good day, Mr. Thornton," Abigail said firmly, turning away in dismissal. With a last, lingering look at Taza, Thornton wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following close behind. "He will be trouble," Taza observed quietly as they watched the riders disappear down the road. Abigail sighed. "He always has been. He wants my water rights. The creek that runs through my property feeds his southern pastures." "And he wants you," Taza added, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. Abigail looked up at him, startled by his directness. "Yes," she admitted, "though not in any way that matters." Something darkened in Taza's expression. "Men like him take what they want. They do not ask." "I can handle Wallace Thornton," Abigail said, with more confidence than she felt. Taza's gaze softened as it met hers. "I believe you can. But now you do not have to handle him alone." The simple declaration settled over Abigail like a warm blanket on a cold night. For so long, she had stood alone against the pressures and threats that came with being a woman on her own in this harsh territory. The idea of having someone at her side, someone who saw her strength rather than sought to diminish it, was as novel as it was comforting. "Why did you really come back, Taza?" she asked, the question that had been burning inside her since his arrival finally finding voice. For a long moment, he was silent, his dark eyes reflecting the morning light. Then, with deliberate care, he reached out and took her hand in his, a gesture so unexpected that Abigail found herself unable to pull away. "Because in all the years between, in all the places I have been," he said softly, "I never felt at home as I did in those few weeks here, with you." The simple truth of his words struck Abigail with the force of revelation. In his eyes, she saw not just the memory of the boy he had been, but the reality of the man he had become, a man who had crossed deserts and decades to find his way back to her. And in that moment, something shifted within her. Like the first tremor before an earthquake, the recognition that the life she had carefully constructed around her solitude was about to change irrevocably. The days that followed took on a rhythm unlike any Abigail had known in her years of solitude. Taza integrated himself into the life of the ranch with quiet efficiency, riding out with Thomas to check the cattle, repairing fences that had languished in disrepair, and bringing to the daily chores a different perspective that often proved invaluable. He showed Abigail how to find water in seemingly barren ground by reading the subtle signs of the desert that her settler's eyes had never been trained to see. He taught her which native plants could heal burns and infections, knowledge passed down through generations of his people who had thrived in this harsh landscape long before white settlers arrived. In turn, Abigail shared with him the books she treasured, volumes of poetry and history that her mother had insisted on bringing west, maintaining that civilization isn't just about where you live, but what lives in you. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, Abigail reading aloud while Taza listened, occasionally asking questions that revealed a depth of thought that challenged and intrigued her. It was during one such evening, as the sky deepened to indigo and the first stars appeared, that Abigail found herself watching Taza's profile against the darkening sky, struck by how natural his presence in her life had come to feel. "You're staring," he said, without turning, a hint of amusement in his voice. Abigail flushed, grateful for the concealing darkness. "I was just thinking how strange it is, how quickly we adjust to change." Now Taza did turn, his expression thoughtful. "Is it change or recognition? What do you mean?" "Sometimes," he said carefully, "what seems new is actually something returning to its proper place." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. In the distance, a coyote called, its plaintive howl echoing across the open land. "Tell me about your life," Abigail said suddenly. "The years between." Taza was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, as if carefully selecting which parts of himself to reveal. "After I left here, I returned to my people. My father was dead, killed in a skirmish with soldiers. My mother had taken my younger sister to live with relatives near the Mexican border." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I was angry then, full of hatred for the white men who had taken so much from us. But not for my family," Abigail said softly. "Not for your family," he agreed. "You showed me another way was possible. It complicated things." He told her of his years with the remaining free bands of Apache, of learning to be a warrior in a time when being a warrior meant certain death, of the decision to become a scout for the army, a choice viewed as betrayal by some of his people, but one he had made with the clear-eyed understanding that adaptation was the only path to survival. "I guided soldiers through lands my ancestors had known for centuries," he said, his voice tinged with old pain. "I helped them find water, safe passages. I never led them to camps where women and children would be in danger, though they suspected me of such loyalty." His hands resting on his knees curled into fists. "I walked the edge of a knife for years." Abigail reached out impulsively, covering his hand with hers. "You survived. You found a way." Taza looked down at their joined hands, then slowly turned his palm upward, his fingers interlacing with hers. The simple contact sent a current through Abigail's body, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. "And you?" he asked. "These years alone, they have not been easy." Abigail smiled faintly. "No, but necessary, perhaps. After my parents died, there were those who thought I should sell the ranch, move to town, find a husband to take care of me. The old frustration colored her voice. As if I hadn't been helping run this place since I was 15. Thornton? Taza guessed. Among others, he was the most persistent. She sighed. When my father was alive, Thornton respected the boundaries. After, she shook her head. At first, it was offers to buy the land. Then offers of protection. Then hints that a woman alone might face misfortunes if she didn't accept help. Taza's hand tightened around hers. He threatened you? Never directly. He's too careful for that. But his meaning was clear enough. Abigail lifted her chin. I learned to shoot straight, to ride fast. To let it be known that I wasn't afraid to defend what's mine. The admiration in Taza's eyes was unmistakable. You are a warrior in your own way, Abby. The use of her childhood name on his lips sent a shiver through her. I did what was necessary. As did I, he replied. Perhaps that is why we understand each other. The night deepened around them, the stars brightening in the vast Arizona sky. Neither moved to break the contact of their joined hands, as if that simple touch were an anchor in a world that had too often tried to sweep them away. It was Thomas who brought the news the next morning, riding in from town with supplies and a grim expression. There's talk, Miss Carter, he said, glancing uneasily at Taza, who was repairing a bridle nearby. About your visitor. Abigail straightened, recognizing the warning in his tone. What kind of talk? Thomas lowered his voice. Thornton's been in the saloon, telling anyone who'll listen that you're harboring an Apache scout who turned on his army employers. Says he's dangerous. Says it ain't right. A white woman alone with an Indian. Anger flared in Abigail's chest. My personal affairs are none of Wallace Thornton's business. No, ma'am, they ain't, Thomas agreed. But folks listen to him. He's got influence. The old cowhand hesitated. There's more. Thornton's been talking to Sheriff Mills, suggesting there might be a warrant out for your friend there, something about stolen army property. Abigail's blood ran cold. That's ridiculous. Maybe, Thomas said, but it wouldn't be the first time a false charge was used to get rid of an Indian, causing trouble for a white man with power. Later, when Thomas had gone to the barn, Abigail found Taza by the corral, his expression making it clear he'd overheard every word. You should leave, she said without preamble. It's not safe for you here. Taza continued working on the bridle, his fingers deft and sure. I've lived with danger before. This is different, Abigail insisted. Thornton has the ear of every important man in the county. If he wants to manufacture charges against you, he can. And if I leave, Taza countered, finally looking up. What happens to you? Alone again with Thornton knowing he has the power to drive away anyone who might stand with you. The truth of his words struck Abigail silent. Thornton's move was calculated, not just to remove Taza, but to demonstrate his control over her life, her connections, her very freedom to choose who could be part of her world. I won't be the cause of harm coming to you, she said finally. Taza set down his work and moved toward her, stopping close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The choice is not yours alone to make. His voice was gentle but firm. I made a promise, Abby. To protect what once protected me. That was a boy's promise, she protested. Made in gratitude, not what? He challenged, his dark eyes searching hers. Abigail swallowed hard, unable to name the thing growing between them. This connection that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds, their shared past, their uncertain future. I'm not leaving, Taza said simply. Not unless you tell me you don't want me here. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken feeling. Abigail knew what she should say, that his presence put them both in danger, that the prudent course was for him to go. But when she opened her mouth, the words that emerged surprised even her. I want you to stay. Something shifted in Taza's expression, a softening, a certainty. With deliberate slowness, he raised his hand to her face, his fingers barely grazing her cheek in a touch so gentle it was almost reverent. Then I stay, he said quietly. Abigail's heart thundered in her chest, her body acutely aware of his nearness, of the calloused warmth of his fingers against her skin. For a dizzying moment she thought he might kiss her, wanted him to kiss her with a sudden fierce longing that took her breath away. Instead he stepped back, his hand falling to his side. We should prepare, he said, his voice rougher than before. Thornton will not stop with words. The spell broken, Abigail nodded, forcing her mind back to the practical concerns at hand. We'll need to be vigilant. Keep the rifles loaded. Take turns keeping watch at night. Yes, Taza agreed. And we should move your cattle away from the boundary with Thornton's land. Bring them closer to the house where they can be protected. They spent the rest of the day implementing these precautions, working side by side with a new awareness humming between them. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and gold, they stood together on a ridge overlooking the ranch. The small house, the barn, the corral, the creek winding its silver path through the property. "It's beautiful," Taza said, following her gaze. "This place." "It's home," Abigail replied simply. Then, after a pause, "It could be yours too." The words slipped out before she could recall them, hanging in the air between them like a revelation. Taza turned to her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Abby!" The crack of a rifle shot cut through the evening stillness, the bullet kicking up dirt at their feet. Instantly, Taza pulled Abigail down behind a boulder, shielding her body with his own, as a second shot splintered bark from a nearby tree. "Shots came from the south ridge," Taza said, his voice calm despite the danger. "Single shooter from the spacing." "Warning shots," Abigail said grimly. "Thornton's way of saying he's watching." "Can you make it back to the house if I cover you?" Taza asked, already reaching for the pistol at his hip. Abigail's hand closed around his wrist. "We go together," she said firmly. "I won't leave you exposed." The look he gave her was equal parts exasperation and admiration. "On three, then. Stay low. Move fast." They made it back to the house without further shots, but the message had been delivered. The line had been drawn, and as they barred the door behind them, Abigail knew with cold certainty that the fragile peace they had found in these past days was about to be shattered. Rain came in the night, a rare and precious gift in the Arizona desert. It drummed on the roof of the ranch house, transforming the parched earth outside into a landscape of rich scents and glistening surfaces. Abigail sat by the window in the kitchen, a rifle across her lap, watching the silvery curtains of water through the glass as she took her turn at watch. Taza entered silently, a cup of coffee in his hand, which he offered to her without a word. She accepted it gratefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "All quiet?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. "Yes. Not even a coyote stirring in this rain." Taza nodded, his gaze moving to the window. "Rain is good. It washes away tracks. Makes it harder for anyone to approach unseen." The practical observation reminded Abigail of the danger that now surrounded them, danger that had come because of his presence in her life. Yet she could not bring herself to regret his return, not even now. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly. "When this is over?" Taza's eyes returned to her face, their expression thoughtful. "That depends." "On what?" "On you," he said simply. "On what you want." The directness of his answer caught Abigail off guard. In the years of her solitude, she had trained herself not to want, or at least not to acknowledge wanting. Desire was a luxury she could ill afford in the business of survival. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, the confession feeling like stones lifted from her chest. "For so long it was just about keeping the ranch, honoring my parents' memory. I never thought about after." "And now?" Taza prompted gently. Abigail set down her coffee cup, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Now I find myself thinking of impossible things." "Nothing is impossible," Taza said, leaning forward slightly. "Only difficult." The rain intensified, drumming harder on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound around them. In this moment, the world beyond the walls of the house seemed distant, unreal. There was only this, the two of them, facing each other across a table in a pool of lamplight, speaking of things that had remained unspoken for too long. "If I were to stay," Taza continued, his voice low and careful, "if we were to build something here, together, it would not be easy. There would be those who would never accept it." "I've never taken the easy path," Abigail replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Not once in my life." A smile touched the corners of Taza's mouth. "No, that is one of the things He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "One of the things I admire about you." The word he had avoided hung in the air between them, as palpable as if it had been spoken aloud. Love. The enormity of it, what it would mean, what it would cost, what it would create, seemed to fill the small kitchen, expanding with each beat of Abigail's heart. "When I was a boy here," Taza said, his voice taking on the cadence of a story long held in memory, "your mother showed me a flower that blooms in the desert after rain, so small, so easily missed. She said that beauty finds a way, even in the harshest places." His eyes held Abigail's. "What grows between us is like that flower, Abby. Unlikely, beautiful, strong enough to push through stone." Abigail's throat tightened with emotion. "Taza." The sound of approaching horses cut through the rain-soaked night, many horses moving fast. In an instant, the intimate moment shattered. Taza was on his feet, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a predator. "6 riders," he reported grimly. "Armed." Abigail grabbed her rifle, checking that it was loaded. "Thornton wouldn't come himself," she said. "He'd send men to do his dirty work." "Get Thomas," Taza instructed. "We'll need every gun." The old cowhand was already awake, alerted by the sound of approaching trouble. The 3 of them took up positions, Thomas at the back door, Abigail at the front window, Taza by the side wall where he could move to wherever he was most needed. The riders pulled up in the yard, their forms indistinct through the rain-streaked glass. One man dismounted, striding toward the house with the confidence of authority. "That's Sheriff Mills," Abigail said, recognizing the distinctive hat and badge even in the dim light. "Thornton's got to him already." The sharp rap on the door confirmed her fears. "Miss Carter," the sheriff called. "This is Sheriff Mills. I need to speak with you immediately." Abigail exchanged a glance with Taza, who nodded once, moving deeper into the shadows of the room. She opened the door a crack, rifle still in hand. "Sheriff, it's late for a social call." Mills stood on her porch, rain dripping from his hat brim, his expression stern beneath his thick mustache. Behind him, his deputies remained mounted, hands near their weapons. "This isn't social, Miss Carter. I have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive, and Apache by the name of Taza, wanted for theft of army property and suspected of providing intelligence to hostile bands." "That's absurd," Abigail said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Who's making these accusations?" "Never mind who," Mills replied. "I have a duty to investigate. I'm going to need to search your property." "Do you have a warrant, Sheriff?" Abigail challenged. Mills's eyes narrowed. "Don't need one when I'm in pursuit of a dangerous fugitive. Now step aside, Miss Carter. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Abigail held her ground. "No, Sheriff. I will not allow you to enter my home on the basis of false accusations and without proper legal authority. If you have charges to file them properly. Until then, this conversation is over." Mills's face darkened with anger. "You're making a mistake, Miss Carter. A serious one." He glanced past her, trying to see into the house. "Is he in there? Is he worth risking everything for?" "Good night, Sheriff," Abigail said firmly, beginning to close the door. Mills's hand shot out, preventing the door from closing. "Listen to me, Abigail. Wallace Thornton is not a man you want as an enemy. He's already talking about how your Apache friend might have been involved in those raids back in '67, the ones where the Miller family was killed." His voice lowered. "People have long memories around here. It wouldn't take much to turn the whole town against you." From the shadows behind her, Taza stepped forward, suddenly visible to the sheriff. "The threat is clear enough, lawman," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Leave now, while you can do so with dignity." Mills's hand moved reflexively toward his gun, but he froze when he saw Thomas emerge from the back of the house, rifle aimed squarely at his chest. "3 guns against 6, Mills said, recovering his composure. "Those aren't odds I'd bet on, Miss Carter." "Then it's fortunate no one is asking you to gamble tonight," Abigail replied coldly. "Leave my property, Sheriff. Now." For a tense moment, Mills stood his ground, the rain running in rivulets from his hat. Then, with a curt nod, he stepped back. "This isn't over," he warned. Not by a long shot. As the riders disappeared into the rainy night, Abigail closed and barred the door, her hands trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. "That was bravely done," Taza said quietly. "Or foolishly," Thomas muttered, lowering his rifle. "Thornton won't stop now, neither will Mills." "No," Abigail agreed, turning to face them both. "This is just the beginning." The rain continued through the night and into the grey dawn, as if the sky itself were weeping for what was to come. None of them slept, taking turns at watch, preparing for whatever the new day might bring. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. It was Taza who spotted the riders coming from the east, not from the direction of town this time, but from the open country beyond. He counted 5 men moving with purpose toward the ranch. Not Thornton's men, he reported, lowering the spyglass. Different horses, different way of riding. Thomas joined him at the window, squinting against the light. Army, he said grimly. Those are cavalry mounts. Abigail's heart sank. If the army had become involved, the situation had escalated beyond what she had feared. How would they know to come here? Thornton, Taza said, his expression hardening. He's called in every favor he has. This time there was no pretense of legal niceties. The soldiers surrounded the house, their lieutenant, a young man with a face weathered beyond his years, dismounting and approaching with the confidence of absolute authority. By order of Colonel James Wilson, commanding officer of Fort Grant, he announced when Abigail opened the door. I am here to apprehend the Apache scout known as Taza, wanted for desertion and theft of military property. There are no deserters here, Lieutenant, Abigail replied, struggling to maintain her composure. Only a free man who completed his service years ago. The lieutenant's expression remained impassive. My orders are clear, ma'am. Please step aside. Before Abigail could respond, Taza appeared beside her. I will go with you, he said quietly. There is no need for violence. Taza, no, Abigail protested, turning to him in dismay. His eyes met hers, filled with a resolve that brooked no argument. It is the only way to keep you safe, he said softly. I will not have blood spilled on your land because of me. This is a lie, Abigail insisted, anger and fear making her voice shake. These charges, they're fabricated by Wallace Thornton. You know that, Lieutenant, she added, turning back to the officer. You're being used as a tool in a land grab. Something flickered in the lieutenant's eyes, doubt, perhaps, or discomfort, but his duty was clear. My orders stand, ma'am. Taza placed a gentle hand on Abigail's shoulder. It will be all right, he said, though they both knew it was a lie. I have faced worse than false accusations before. I'm coming with you, Abigail said, a decision forming in her mind with crystalline clarity. I'll speak to Colonel Wilson myself. Miss Carter, Thomas began, concern etched on his weathered face. Stay here, Thomas, she instructed firmly. Watch the ranch. I'll return as soon as I can. The ride to Fort Grant was conducted in tense silence, Abigail and Taza surrounded by vigilant soldiers who kept their hands near their weapons at all times. Taza rode with his head high, his bearing proud despite the circumstances. Occasionally, his eyes would meet Abigail's across the space between them, conveying a reassurance she desperately wanted to believe. Fort Grant rose from the landscape like an assertion of order imposed on wilderness. Wooden buildings arranged in military precision, the stars and stripes fluttering in the breeze above the commander's quarters. As they rode through the gates, Abigail was acutely aware of the stares that followed them. A white woman accompanying an Apache prisoner, an anomaly that challenged the rigid boundaries of their world. Colonel Wilson proved to be a man of late middle age, his hair grey at the temples, his uniform impeccable. He received Abigail in his office with formal courtesy, though his eyes were cold and assessing. Miss Carter, he acknowledged, gesturing to a chair. Lieutenant Hayes informs me you wish to speak regarding the Apache prisoner. His name is Taza, Abigail said, refusing to be cowed by the colonel's formality. And he is not a deserter or a thief. He completed his service honorably years ago. Wilson's expression remained neutral. We have information to the contrary. From Wallace Thornton, no doubt, Abigail countered, a man with a vested interest in removing Taza from my property so he can pressure me into selling my land. A flicker of surprise crossed Wilson's face. Mr. Thornton did bring certain information to our attention, yes, but these are serious charges, Miss Carter. Not the sort of thing we pursue lightly. Then show me the evidence, Abigail challenged. Show me the records of what was stolen when Taza allegedly deserted. Show me anything that would substantiate these claims. Wilson studied her for a long moment, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk. You seem quite invested in this man's fate, Miss Carter. The implication was clear, and Abigail felt heat rise to her face, not from shame, but from anger at the judgment in his tone. I am invested in justice, Colonel. My family saved Taza's life when he was a boy. He returned to repay that debt. There is nothing more to it than that. It was a lie, and from Wilson's expression, he knew it as well as she did. But propriety prevented him from calling her on it directly. "Regardless of your personal feelings," Wilson said carefully, "the matter will be investigated according to military protocol. If Taza is innocent, he has nothing to fear." They both knew that was another lie. An Apache accused by a respected white landowner had everything to fear, regardless of innocence. "Where is he now?" Abigail asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "In the stockade. He will remain there until the matter is resolved. I want to see him." Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That would be highly irregular, Miss Carter." "So is arresting a man on false charges as a favor to someone with influence," Abigail retorted. "I insist, Colonel." Perhaps it was the steel in her voice, or perhaps Wilson himself harbored doubts about the situation. Either way, after a tense pause, he nodded curtly. 5 minutes under guard. The stockade was a grim building on the far side of the fort, its small windows barred, its door heavy and reinforced. Inside, the air was stale and close, redolent with the smells of unwashed bodies and despair. Taza was in the last cell, sitting on a narrow cot, his back straight, his expression composed despite his surroundings. When he saw Abigail, something in his face softened. A brief flash of vulnerability quickly masked. 5 minutes, the guard reminded her gruffly, taking up a position by the door. Abigail moved closer to the bars, keeping her voice low. "This is wrong. All of it." "Many things in this world are wrong, Abby," Taza replied quietly. "This is just one more." "I'll find a way to prove your innocence," she promised. "I'll go to the territorial governor if I have to." Taza shook his head slightly. "Thornton has planned well. He knows that even if the charges are eventually dismissed, I will be held here for weeks, perhaps months. Long enough for him to pressure you, to threaten your land, to turn the town against you for harboring me." The truth of his assessment struck Abigail like a physical blow. Thornton had indeed thought several moves ahead, placing them in an impossible position. "Then what?" she asked, frustration edging her voice. "We just let him win." Taza moved closer to the bars, his voice dropping even lower. "No, we changed the game." His eyes held hers, intense and determined. "Listen carefully. There is a man in Tucson, Jacob Foster. He was a captain when I scouted for the army. He knows the truth of my service, has the records to prove it." "I'll find him," Abigail promised immediately. "There's more," Taza continued. "Thornton is not just after your land. There are rumors of silver on the eastern ridge, your eastern ridge. It's why he's become so desperate to force you out." Abigail's eyes widened. "Silver? Are you certain?" "No, but it would explain much." Taza glanced toward the guard, who was beginning to look impatient. "Be careful, Abby. Thornton will be watching your movements. If he suspects you're gathering evidence against him—" "Time's up," the guard called, moving toward them. Impulsively, Abigail reached through the bars, her fingers brushing Taza's cheek in a gesture of tenderness she could no longer deny or hide. "I will come back for you," she said fiercely. "I promise." Something flared in Taza's eyes, hope perhaps, or a deeper emotion he had kept carefully guarded. "I know," he replied softly. "Some promises are kept, even across decades." The ride back to the ranch was a solitary journey through a landscape that suddenly seemed fraught with hidden dangers. Abigail's mind raced with plans and contingencies, with the weight of what she had learned and the challenge that lay ahead. Thomas was waiting for her when she returned, his worried expression easing slightly at the sight of her unharmed. "They're keeping him at the fort," she explained, dismounting wearily. "On false charges, but that hardly matters. It's all part of Thornton's plan to isolate me, to make me vulnerable." The old cowhand nodded grimly. "What do we do now, Miss Carter?" Abigail straightened, a new resolve hardening within her. "Now, Thomas, we fight back. In every way we can." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Abigail rode to Tucson, finding retired Captain Foster exactly where Taza had said he would be. The aging officer, now running a small law practice, remembered Taza well. "Best scout I ever worked with," he confirmed, leafing through old journals and records he had kept from his service days. "Loyal, honest, saved my life twice over." He looked up, his eyes sharp with interest. "These charges, they're nonsense." Taza completed his service honorably. "I have the discharge papers to prove it." "Will you testify to that?" Abigail asked eagerly. Foster hesitated. "Going against the army, even in retirement, isn't a simple matter, Miss Carter, and if Wallace Thornton is involved—" He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But yes, I'll testify if it comes to that. Truth matters, especially when it's in short supply." Armed with Foster's affidavit and copies of the relevant military records, Abigail then sought out a mining engineer who owed her father a favor from years past. For a modest fee and a promise of discretion, he agreed to survey the eastern ridge of her property. Thornton's information was good, the engineer confirmed 3 days later, dust still clinging to his clothes from the survey. "There's silver there, all right. Not a massive vein, but valuable enough to explain his interest." Meanwhile, Thomas had been making discreet inquiries in town, discovering that Thornton had recently taken on significant debt with investors from back east, debt that a silver strike could conveniently resolve. The pieces were falling into place, revealing the full scope of Thornton's scheme, but knowing the truth and proving it in a way that would secure Taza's freedom were different matters entirely. It was on her return from a meeting with the territorial marshal, a frustrating encounter that had yielded little beyond vague promises to look into the matter, that Abigail found her path blocked by Thornton himself. He sat astride his horse in the middle of the trail, alone for once, his expression smug as he watched her approach. "Miss Carter," he greeted her, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "You've been quite busy of late, riding to Tucson, meeting with mining engineers. One might think you were up to something." Abigail reined in her horse, maintaining a cautious distance. "My activities are no concern of yours, Mr. Thornton." "Oh, but they are," he replied, his smile not reaching his eyes, "especially when they involve attempting to interfere with legitimate legal proceedings against a dangerous fugitive." "There is nothing legitimate about the charges against Taza," Abigail said coldly, "and we both know it." Thornton's facade of pleasantness slipped, revealing the calculation beneath. "What I know, Miss Carter, is that you're in an untenable position. Your Apache friend will remain in custody for the foreseeable future. Your ranch is struggling. Don't think I haven't noticed the condition of your cattle, the state of your fences. You're one bad season away from ruin." "Is that why you've gone to such elaborate lengths?" Abigail challenged. "Creating false charges, involving the army, spreading rumors in town, all for my struggling ranch?" A flicker of surprise crossed Thornton's face, quickly masked. "I'm merely pointing out the reality of your situation. I'm still willing to offer you a fair price for your land, more than fair considering the circumstances." "And if I refuse?" Thornton's expression hardened. "Then you'll find yourself very much alone, Miss Carter. No Apache protector, no sympathetic neighbors. Not even old Thomas once he realizes he's hitched his wagon to a losing cause." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "How long do you think you can hold out? A month? 2? Winter's coming. It would be a shame to face it without resources or friends." The threat was clear, but instead of fear, Abigail felt a cold clarity descend over her. In that moment, she saw Thornton for what he truly was, not an invincible enemy, but a desperate man overreaching, taking risks that exposed vulnerabilities of his own. "I think we're done here, Mr. Thornton," she said calmly, gathering her reins. "I suggest you move aside." Thornton's face flushed with anger. "This is your last chance, Abigail. Take my offer, or face the consequences." "I've been facing consequences all my life," she replied, nudging her horse forward. "Yours don't frighten me." As she rode past him, Thornton called after her, his voice tight with fury. "You'll regret this decision, I promise you that." Abigail didn't look back. There was work to be done, a plan to execute, and a promise of her own to keep. The opportunity came 3 days later, when Colonel Wilson agreed to meet with Captain Foster to review the evidence regarding Taza's service record. Abigail, using connections her father had established years before, managed to ensure that the territorial marshal would also be present, a neutral witness to proceedings that might otherwise be dominated by military protocol and prejudice. The meeting was tense, Foster's clear documentation and forthright testimony contrasting sharply with the vague, second-hand accusations that formed the basis of the charges against Taza. As the discussion progressed, it became increasingly evident that the case against Taza was built on nothing more substantial than Thornton's word and the Army's willingness to accept it without question. "This is troubling," the Marshal observed, examining the discharge papers Foster had provided. "Very troubling indeed. It appears a grave injustice may have been perpetrated here. Colonel Wilson, to his credit, seemed genuinely disturbed by the evidence before him. "I was not aware of Captain Foster's records," he admitted. "Mr. Thornton's accusations seemed credible, given his standing in the community." "And given that the accused is Apache?" Abigail added pointedly. Wilson had the grace to look uncomfortable. "The situation is complex, Miss Carter." "No," she countered. "It's quite simple. An innocent man is being held on false charges, and the man who orchestrated those charges stands to gain financially from his imprisonment." She laid out what they had discovered about the silver deposit, about Thornton's debts, about his increasingly desperate attempts to acquire her land. By the end of the meeting, Wilson had agreed to release Taza, pending a formal review of the charges, a face-saving measure that everyone present understood was merely a prelude to their dismissal. The marshal, disturbed by the implications of corruption and conspiracy, promised to investigate Thornton's activities more thoroughly. It was nearly sunset when Taza walked out of the fort's gates, free for the first time in weeks. Abigail, waiting with their horses, felt her heart swell at the sight of him. Thinner, perhaps, his face more angular than before, but unbowed, his eyes finding hers immediately across the dusty yard. No words were needed as he approached. The understanding between them had grown beyond the need for verbal affirmation. He simply took her hand in his, a gesture that spoke volumes in its quiet intimacy. "Let's go home," Abigail said softly. The word hung in the air between them. Home, with all its implications of belonging, of future, of shared purpose. Taza's fingers tightened around hers, his eyes reflecting the dying light of the sun. "Yes," he replied simply. "Home." They rode side by side as the first stars appeared in the eastern sky, the vast Arizona landscape stretching before them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The challenges ahead remained formidable. Thornton's defeat was far from complete. The prejudices of their world still stood firm. The path they had chosen would never be an easy one. But in that moment, with the distance between them finally bridged by truth and trust and something deeper than either, the future seemed not a burden to be feared, but a horizon to be explored together. As the lights of the ranch house came into view, Taza reached into his pocket, withdrawing the small carved stone eagle that Abigail had kept all these years, and returned to him before his arrest. "In my people's beliefs," he said, his voice low and rich in the gathering darkness, "eagles carry messages between earth and sky, between the world of the living and the world beyond." He held the carving in his open palm, offering it back to her. "This has carried our promise across years and miles. Now it will watch over what we build together." Abigail took the eagle, then caught Taza's hand before he could withdraw it, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture as ancient as humanity itself, the joining of lives, the sharing of fate. "What we build," she echoed, her voice steady with certainty. "Together." The ranch house waited ahead, its windows glowing with welcome light. And as they rode toward it side by side, Abigail knew that whatever battles still lay before them, they would face them as they had always been meant to, not as savior and saved, not as debtor and creditor, but as equals, bound by a love that had begun in childhood compassion and matured into something as enduring as the desert itself. The story of the wounded Apache boy and the girl who had helped save him had come full circle. And now a new story was beginning, one they would write together, under the vast Arizona sky that had witnessed their separation and now blessed their reunion. In the end, it was not just a promise that had been kept, but a destiny fulfilled. Two souls finding in each other the home they had always sought, in a land that demanded courage, in a time that required defiance, in a love that transcended all boundaries. Spring came early to Arizona that year, painting the desert with wildflowers in a rare display of abundance. On the Carter Ranch, now known to some as the Carter-Taza Ranch, though such joint ownership between a white woman and an Apache man existed more in practice than in official records, the creek ran full and strong, nourishing land that had known too many seasons of drought. Abigail stood on the porch, watching as Taza instructed a group of Apache children in the art of tracking. The children, from families who had gradually settled on the far edges of the property, followed his movements with rapt attention, their faces serious with concentration as they learned skills that connected them to their heritage. The settlement had begun slowly, cautiously after Thornton's downfall. The investigation into his affairs had revealed not just the silver conspiracy, but a pattern of corruption and intimidation that had finally cost him the influence he had wielded for so long. With his power broken, and with the tacit support of Captain Foster, now a judge in the territorial court, Abigail and Taza had begun to create something unprecedented, a place where Apache families displaced from their traditional lands could find refuge and dignity. It wasn't easy. There had been resistance from neighbors, threats from those who saw any cooperation with the Apache as betrayal. The pastor had refused to marry them, forcing them to travel to Tucson, where a more progressive minister had been willing to perform a ceremony that many considered illegal or immoral. Even now they faced challenges daily: suspicious glances in town, the occasional act of vandalism, the constant need to prove that their vision was not a threat, but a path forward. But there had been unexpected allies too. Thomas, loyal to the end, the territorial marshal impressed by their courage and integrity, a young army lieutenant, the same one who had arrested Taza, who now occasionally visited, bringing supplies and information, drawn by the possibility that coexistence need not mean subjugation. Abigail smiled as one of the children, a girl of perhaps 7 with bright, inquisitive eyes, spotted a track that had eluded the others, earning a nod of approval from Taza. In that moment, watching the interaction between her husband and the child, Abigail felt the full weight of what they had created together. Not just a home for themselves, but a sanctuary for others, a place where the wounds of the past might begin to heal. Taza looked up, catching her gaze across the yard. Even now, after months of marriage, the connection between them retained its power to take her breath away. The recognition of a bond that had begun in childhood compassion and grown into something as enduring as the land itself. He said something to the children, who scattered toward their homes with the boundless energy of youth, then crossed the yard to join her on the porch. Without a word, he took her hand in his, their fingers interlacing in the gesture that had become their private affirmation. "You're smiling," he observed, his own lips curving in response. "I was thinking about promises," Abigail replied. "The ones we keep, the ones we make." Taza's expression softened with understanding. In the months since his release, in the gradual building of their shared life, they had learned to read each other with an intimacy that transcended words. "And what new promises are you contemplating?" he asked, his voice warm with affection. Abigail turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "I was thinking about the promise of new life," she said softly. "Of family." Taza's eyes widened slightly as her meaning registered. "Abby," he breathed, his voice catching. "Are you certain?" She nodded, joy and trepidation mingling in her heart. A child, their child, would face challenges neither of them could fully anticipate or prevent. The world was not kind to those who existed between established boundaries, but it was also true that boundaries changed, that the impossible sometimes became possible through love and persistence, and the simple revolutionary act of living one's truth. "I am certain," she said firmly, "of this, of us, of everything we've built and everything we will build." Taza gathered her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that still had the power to heal the lonely places within her. Above them, the vast Arizona sky stretched endlessly, witness to their defiance, their love, their hope. "Then we will make this promise together," he murmured against her hair, "as we have made all others." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land they had fought for and won, Abigail closed her eyes and allowed herself to envision the future, not as a burden to be feared, but as a gift to be embraced. A future built on a promise made decades ago by a wounded boy and a compassionate girl, neither of whom could have imagined where that simple act of humanity would eventually lead. Some promises once made changed everything. Some loves once found could never be lost again, and some stories, even in the harsh realities of the American West, found their way to endings that were not just happy, but profoundly, defiantly just. In the gathering twilight, as the first stars appeared above their home, Abigail and Taza stood together on the threshold of that future, bound by promises kept and promises yet to be made, their love a testament to the enduring truth that even in the most divided of worlds, hearts could find their way home. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart like it did ours, Please don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. From the bottom of our hearts, your support is what inspires us to keep bringing you new stories, filled with love, redemption, and unexpected turns. And before you go, at the end of this video, there's another powerful story waiting for you. Click it and be surprised by another emotional tale, just as moving and unforgettable as this one.